that I work with paleontologists. What's that? Oh, okay. Let me just say, got it. Okay, I think we're good now. All the technical bugs should be flowing or out of here. So yeah, as Julia said, my name is Brian Engh. I'm a paleoartist. I work with paleontologists to reconstruct prehistoric animals and their environments. And over the course of the last about 6 years now, I've been working closely with a handful of paleontologists in Utah and Colorado on dinosaurs and fossil sites in the Morrison Formation, and incorporating new discoveries and new insights about the Morrison Formation into artwork. For those that don't know, the Morrison Formation is this famous and vast depositional, it's a rock formation that was laid down by in this huge depositional basin that covered a big chunk of Western North America about 150 million years ago in the late Jurassic period. And it's where some of the world's most famous dinosaurs come from. Dinosaurs that were discovered in the early days of paleontology, during like the Bone Wars era. Things like Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Brontosaurus, and the Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, Barosaurus. Some of the coolest dinosaurs that we've ever discovered have been found in the Morrison right here in the Western United States. And I've been lucky enough to go out with expeditions looking for new fossil sites, because even after 150 years of study, or a little over that, we're still discovering new stuff in the Morrison, and we're only just now beginning to understand it as a complete environment and ecosystem with, how did it work? How did all these giant animals coexist with each other? We know from numerous fossil sites that they did indeed coexist with each other, because they often died and were buried together. So in order to understand that ecosystem, I and my collaborators, I think, pretty much agree that paleoart is a great process to kind of work through in your imagination how these different animals and plants and creatures and everything, how it all worked together. So today, what we're going to talk about, based on a Twitter poll, so thank you to those of you who voted on Twitter, we're going to talk about reconstructing Stegosaurus. In order to reconstruct the whole ecology, we kind of have to start with each individual organism one at a time and try and figure out how they work and how all that fits together in a bigger picture. So today we're going to focus on Stegosaurus. Now, Stegosaurus is an iconic dinosaur, but like so many things from the Morrison, we're still learning new things about it. What I have up here is a reference image that we're going to use. Often I will meet with paleontologists, I'll visit museums, I'll take lots of pictures of fossils, and I'll even record the interpretations of paleontologists to try and get a better understanding of how to interpret these fossils in art. What we have here is a mount from the Natural History Museum in London of the most complete Stegosaurus yet found and described. They've nicknamed her Sophie. We don't actually know if it's a male or female, because we don't know how to tell that with these armored dinosaurs. But Sophie is kind of an average sized Stegosaurus. She's about, I think, right around 20 feet long. And she's really complete with almost every bone from Sophie. And they've made this really nice, really up to date skeletal mount at the Natural History Museum of London. And so we'll be looking at that, as well as some fossils from the Museum of Western Colorado of Stegosaurus, to try and understand how all the pieces of this weird creature fit together. I've often said that if I could see one non-bird dinosaur in real life, to just fully see it fleshed out, I think a Stegosaur would be one of the ones I'd pick, because they're so different from anything alive today. They're all the way over on the branch of the dinosaur family tree that's about as far from birds as you can get. And you just look at it, it's this crazy animal. It has all these plates going down its back. It's got huge spikes on its tail. And one of the things that struck me about seeing Sophie in person was her neck's really long. One of the things we artists will do is we'll take a pencil or something like that, and you guys can do this and follow along at home if you want, and we'll measure out things. So we'll take our finger, and I'll go, okay, her neck goes from the tip of my pencil to about here where my thumb is. And you can actually use that to, you can, with another pencil, you can mark on your page approximate sizes of things, and you can compare the proportions. So I've cheated a little bit. I got a bit of a head start lightly sketching some parts of Sophie, but we're going to go over some of the basic anatomy and how we understand that anatomy according to the latest science of dinosaurs and also by studying modern animals. So if you're following along at home, I'm going to start from the tail first. Now, Sophie has a pretty long tail. In this skeletal mount, it's kind of sweeping away from the camera. So when you draw it, you don't have to have it swinging up and away like that. You could draw it straight. You could make it a little longer. Imagine it swinging towards there. It'd probably be about that long, something like that. The tail's maybe 20 to 30% longer than the body, something like that. So I'm going to draw my tail in. I had it swinging up in my very rough sketch, but I just now decided I don't want to do it like that. So I'm going to draw some construction lines. And one of the things I'm paying attention to is these parts of the skeleton that are sticking out. Very often things on skeletons that stick out are where muscles attach. And that's very true of pretty much everything in the tail. All these little processes hanging down off the bottom of the tail, those are where tail muscles attach. Same with the top of the tail. So I'm going to rough in an outline based on what I see in the tail. And what's going to happen is we're going to get to here. There's this weird bone, the hip bone, which has this crazy shape to it. It's kind of triangular. It's got these two things that sweep back like that. And then right about here, there's the hip socket. And then up here is a bone we call the ilium. And the ilium is really important. You can feel your ilium in your waist here. It's this big curvy top of the pelvis bone where all your thigh muscles attach to. And thigh muscles and muscles that even go to the lower leg. And then we're going to sketch in that femur. Now, if I didn't cheat first, what I would do is I'd go, okay, this femur, let's see, it's about that long, and I could draw it kind of one for one that way. The other thing I can do is I can kind of eyeball it and go, okay, the femur is looks like it's about 3/4 of the length of the body. So if my body's, let's see, my body from the tip of the pelvis to the neck is about like that, then the femur needs to be about 3/4 that length. Put it over here. We'll rough that in. And what we're going to do is we're going to use these skeletal landmarks to do a quick and dirty muscular reconstruction. And I'll explain what some of those muscles do and how we know what they do. So now we go to the lower leg. Now, if you look on the skeleton, the lower leg the bones are a bit chunkier. That's because there's two bones down there called tibia and fibia. And they have a whole bunch of they have a whole bunch of muscle attached to them, which help to stabilize the leg when this big animal is walking. And then the feet are these kind of short, stumpy things with these strong toes that are kind of stocky on the bottom. And they've done a really nice job mounting the skeletal mount. They've got the toes kind of curved, but not flat, which is what we think that these feet would have been doing based on footprints. But also we can look at things like elephants and rhinos. A lot of these big, heavy animals, they have a big fatty pad in the heel of their foot. And then they have big fatty pads underneath each of their toes. So I'm actually I'm gonna rough in some fatty pads, and that's consistent with what we see it from footprints that have been referred to Stegosaurus. So then we got this pelvis here. Now there's some stuff missing from this skeletal mount. There's these bones called the gastralia, and we'll get to them in a second. They're like the ribs of the belly. I'm gonna rough in just kind of a tube, and I'm gonna draw curved lines on the tube. Very rough. I'm not putting in every single vertebrae, but this is just going to kind of guide us where in space our vertebrae is. And then we get to this thing. Let's throw some ribs in there. And we'll notice on Sophie, the ribs come right down to about the knee. And then as the body slopes downward, they come a little lower than the knee. So I'm just going to rough those in just to get a sense of that shape. And the reason I'm drawing the curvature, I'm not super worried for this drawing about drawing every single rib perfectly, but I want to get that curvature. I want to capture that because that curvature is going to inform how we draw texture on top of the body of the animal. Now there's this big weird bone here that's kind of shaped like a malformed spoon or the Big Dipper. And that's the scapula and coracoid. So the scapula comes down like this, and then it intersects with the coracoid, and the coracoid come together. There's two of them, and they come together to form basically a breastbone. And those are important muscle attachment points for the arm. So we have the humerus is the upper arm bone. It's coming down like this, and it's also quite chunky. It has these big flanges on it. And then a little bit longer than the humerus and also quite chunky is the radius and the ulna, which are the bones of the lower arm. And the way you can remember which is which, something I learned in anatomy class in high school, is if you're looking at your hand, the pinky goes to the ulna, and you can remember that like PU, people say PU when something smells really bad. I don't know why that's stuck in my brain, but PU, pinky ulna, and then thumb to the radius. Now, humans, we have kind of really special radius and ulnas, which allow us to rotate our wrists. Dinosaurs and crocodilians, their radius and ulnas are a little bit stiffer and don't allow them quite the same articulation as we have. And they have really big muscle attachment points on that lower arm area because there's a lot of animal weight going down on this front limb. So they need to be able to stabilize that limb with big muscles that stabilize the upper arm and then connect that all the way down to the toes or the fingers, which again are going to have some fatty pads. So I'm drawing this in lateral view, so I'm not going to draw every single toe or finger. And then we look, they've got their mount with one arm a little bit straighter. I'm just going to copy that because basically this is a drawing exercise so that we get familiar with the proportions of this animal. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this animal has a surprisingly long neck. If we put our finger on the hip, like where the femur goes into the hip socket, put our other finger on the end of the scapula, that sort of spatula shaped thing, move that over, and we start to the neck. Basically from the base of the neck at the scapula to the tip of the snout is about as long as that whole length of the body. A lot of older reconstructions of Stegosaurus, you'll notice this everywhere now. They have much shorter necks than that. So we're actually we're gonna give ours a nice long neck. I'm gonna measure it out. Okay, so femur to the tip of the scapula, that will give me about the head and neck length. And my earlier sketch, I had it a little bit off. Now the head is kind of this elongated triangle that's a little bit rounded off. And then again, I'm just gonna draw like a simple tube, and I'm gonna give that curvature to remind me of the shape of this thing. And again, there's ribs going through here. Now underneath here, there would have been a bunch of belly ribs. These are ribs that form inside the abdominal muscles. So imagine if your six pack got so ripped that your body was like, man, we got to the only way to make this thing harder is to put bone in it. And so what'll actually happen with a lot of these archosaurs, dinosaurs and crocodilians, is that the body reinforces the tendons of the abdominal muscles with calcium and makes ossified ligaments or basically ossified musculature, essentially. So we're just going to sketch those in, and those usually form a pretty, at least in crocodilians and in the dinosaurs we found articulated, they pretty much just round out that belly. And then back here, all this area will get filled in as well, because now what we're going to start to move on to is the musculature. Actually, I take that back. We're going to talk about the plates real quick and then the musculature, because the plates are another weird situation where the animal's body has started reinforcing a soft tissue feature with bone. So what the osteoderms of Stegosaurus actually are, and I'm going to click into a picture from the Museum of Western Colorado, our gracious hosts. This is a real stegosaur plate. And one of the things that I noticed, and researchers have pointed out to me about real stegosaur plates, is that they never have a clean edge on them. And there's a reason for that. It's because this bone is forming inside of something called it's forming inside of a scale. It's something called an osteoderm. Osteo means bone, derm means of the skin. So this is a skin bone, basically. What happens is that if you look at basically this is like the plate on the back of a crocodile. If you look on a crocodile's back, you'll see these, if you look at them from the front, they look like this. There's these armor studs on the plate on the back of a crocodile. And what they are is they're a basement scale that has a raised ridge in the middle. And what happens with crocodiles as they get older is their body puts bone inside of that scale to reinforce it, to make it into a really impenetrable armor. Now, Stegosaurus has basically the same shape to its plates, but it's exaggerated some things. It's made the base way wider, and then that middle section, it's grown up really tall. But why is the edge unfinished? The reason for that is because it's not the whole structure. Covering that bone is a sheath of what we call keratin. It's the same stuff that your hair and fingernails is made out of. It's the same stuff that your dead skin cells or the surface of your skin is made out of. Keratin is this really durable body covering that covers pretty much all vertebrates. And what basically is happening is Stegosaurus had some kind of a weird scale shape that their body reinforced. And that's kind of fun for me as a paleoartist, because what that means is that we don't actually know the full shape of stegosaur plates. There was more there that we have yet to find a perfect outline of in the fossil record. We have found some impressions of the keratin from stegosaur plates, but we've never found like a really complete, perfect outline, because that keratin usually rots in most fossilization situations. In this picture, you can see the base of that plate. It's got this like this sort of Y-shaped base, and that would actually sit on top of the vertebrae of Stegosaurus, and there were muscles that attached up into those base of those plates, which is something we see in crocodilians as well. There's these muscle fibers that run through the skin and actually like suture everything together. So anyway, in Stegosaurus, we always see this ragged edge on the plates, because what that is, that's basically where the body was like, okay, I don't need to make any more bone at somewhere along this edge. It just kind of grades in to that keratin that covered it. So one of the really fun things about this is that every one of these plates is a slightly different shape on Sophie. She's one of the most complete ones. Her plate order is reasonably well known. There's an even better specimen called the roadkill specimen, where the plates are in exact order. Well, what's wild is there's a lot of variation in these features. This one, I don't know how well you can see this. I'm gonna kind of outline it with my pen. This is a big plate at Dinosaur National Monument that has a really unusual shape. This is the base right here, and then it bulges out, and then it starts to come to a point. But again, we don't have a finished edge on that point. This is Dr. Matt Wadle, who's one of the Morrison paleontologists that I've been working with. And you can see how big this thing is. There was quite a size range in the known stegosaur specimens. Sophie, like I said, about 20 feet long. Her arm bone, like her shoulder height, probably would only come up to maybe my waist or middle of my torso. And I'm about 6 feet tall, so I don't know, what is that? A little over a meter at the shoulder. There's a Stegosaurus forelimb at the Fieldhouse Museum in Utah. It's fully like, gosh, it's got to be like 5.5, almost 6 feet, almost 2 meters tall. So Stegosaurus got way bigger than Sophie. But as a general rule, most of the really big stuff in the Morrison is also really incomplete. So I'm going to give Sophie a few of these weird shaped ones just for fun, because you don't normally see them in paleoart. So I'm going to go back to my picture of Sophie where I can see the whole row. And what's cool is that up by her head, the plates are like these little triangular things. And the other interesting thing about stegosaurs is the plates are staggered. With crocodilians, very often the scutes sit right next to each other. They form tidy rows. In stegosaurs, they're staggered. So one will be kind of further behind the other. So I'm gonna remind myself of that by shading one of the plates. And let's see, how many pairs are there in Sophie? There's a bunch of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19? Is it really an odd number? There might be one that I can't quite see because of perspective. In fact, there might be a double there. So it's around 20 plates. And that, again, because this is a feature of the skin, it's totally possible that there's variation in the plate number between stegosaur specimens. I mean, if you count the scales on the back of an iguana, they're not all going to be exactly the same number between different animals. So I'm going to put about 20. So we got 3, I'm going to put 4. I'm just trying to eyeball out the spacing. Again, we don't know the exact spacing because all of these skeletons are disarticulated when they got buried in rivers and ponds where these animals died. So 4, I'm going to do 5, 6. I made that one really pointy. 7. And as we're moving back, the plates take on a slightly different shape. They become kind of, they get that bit of that bulge at the base, and then they start to get a little pointier. They become almost like a triangle sitting on top of the rectangle. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm going to put one behind that. So that'll be 10, 11. And again, I'm not being too precious about the shape of these things. It's 12, 13. And they seem to be the biggest over the hips. All right, so that's about 20. And then there's 4 more osteoderms at the end of the tail. And these ones are really cool. Some scientists call them thagomizers after a Far Side comic. Dr. Susie Maidment in the UK, who described Sophie, hates the term thagomizers, so don't use it around her. But in the Far Side comic, they're named Thagomizer because there's a caveman named Thag who was obliterated by these. Now, of course, cavemen didn't live alongside dinosaurs, but we do know that Stegosauruses did, in all likelihood, use these to defend themselves because there's an Allosaurus tailbone with a puncture wound in it that actually healed, or partially healed. It got infected, but it perfectly fits the shape of these tail spines. Now, one of the things that's really cool when you look at the actual fossils, not like a sculpted reconstruction, is these things aren't perfectly straight and they're not perfectly round. They kind of have a bit of a ridge on them. They're almost blade-like. And again, that's because they're a modification of this basic plate shape. They are just a super elongated, pointy version of those plates. Now, again, I'm just roughing out the bone core that's inside those osteoderms, those bones of the skin. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have a bunch of fun adding soft tissue on top of those. But first, we're going to talk about musculature because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. I'm going to quickly rough in. I kind of did an outline first. And you'll notice that like I put this outline really far down back here, and that's because there's actually a huge muscle that runs from about midway down the tail all the way up to the back of the hip bone. And it inserts back here. It's called the M-cotofemoralis longus muscle. It's this big tube muscle that can swing the tail back and forth. And if the muscles on the top of the tail are stiffened up, it actually pulls back on the femur. So this is the main muscle that dinosaurs and other archosaurs were using in order to pull their femurs backward. And so I'm going to rough that in here. And we can estimate the size of that based in part on those bones that are hanging down on the bottom of the tail, the little tail, we call them tail chevrons, these ones hanging down. The M-cotofemoralis longus attaches to those, and then it kind of slings down and attaches to this big muscle attachment point on the back of the femur called the fourth trochanter. And it leaves this big tendon scar big ligament, big tendon scar where that muscle inserts into the back of the femur, just above halfway down. I always get tendons and ligaments mixed up. Ligaments hold bones together, tendons attach muscles to bones, and in some cases, muscles to muscles. So like I said, there's these big muscles that run across the top of the tail, connecting to all those spinal processes up there, and they actually wrap over the M-cotofemoralis longus, and they attach down to the ischium, which is the rearmost of these two pelvic bones sticking down. And those are called the ischiocaudalis muscles, at least in crocodiles, that's what they're called. The funny thing about anatomical terms is that different researchers who study different animals actually use different terms. So in general, in paleontology, dinosaur paleontologists usually use the muscle names that are used for crocodilians. But then there's like a whole different set of muscle terminology for birds, so it can get a bit confusing. Birds have rearranged things pretty dramatically. Now remember, there's this thing called the ilium along the top. This is also a huge muscle attachment point, and it has these big thigh muscles that attach down, all the way down to the upper part of the lower leg. And the ones up here are called actually all of these are called the iliotibialis because they go from the ilium to the tibia. And then there's a whole bundle of calf muscles that wrap around and connect a whole bunch of stuff together. I'm not going to get into all the detail of those. And quite frankly, I don't have all of it memorized. So we have this big chicken thigh back here. And then there's muscles that also attach from the pubes, the pubic bone, which is the front of these two bones hanging down, and from the ischium to the inner thigh area. So they go basically from that pelvic bone in the middle of the animal, and they go out and they connect inside the knee essentially to hold those big legs close to the body. That's the muscle group that dinosaurs use to keep their legs straight up and down underneath them, which makes them more efficient at locomotion. And it keeps them from like dislocating their hips or having a sprawling gait like other reptiles. Now, along the back here, there's also a bunch of big muscles that embed those osteoderms. Well, they go over the vertebral spines, but then some of those muscles are actually going to embed around the base of those osteoderms. And then there's big shoulder muscles, which go, I'm just going to rough those in real quick. They completely cover the scapulocoracoid. There's big chest muscles that goes from the scapula plates into the top of the humerus. There's something on the humerus called the deltopectoral crest, which is where Dinosaur's pectoralis muscles actually grab onto this big like wing of bone that comes off of the humerus. And then we've got the triceps, which actually goes from the elbow just below the humerus all the way up the scapula. And then there's all the forearm muscles, the stabilizing muscles that are, stabilizing those big fingers, keeping them nice and pulling them stiffening and straightening them and allowing the animal to balance on those little fingers. So those muscles are pretty darn big in crocodilians. And like we said, Sophie is a pretty darn big animal. I'm roughing in those belly muscles that she would have had there. And then if you look on this fossil, there's a cool feature that's very similar to what we see in birds on the underside of the neck. I should have zoomed in a while ago. See these triangle things coming off of the back of the neck vertebrae? They're kind of pointing down and backwards. So this is the upper part of the vertebrae, and then there's these triangle things that swoop backwards. Those are muscle attachment points, a little bit like the ones we have on the tail. That's where the emculus longi muscles of the neck attach. And so there would be these big bundles of muscles that come down, and they bundle down. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they attach to the scapula, if I'm not mistaken. I got to check on that. But those allow the neck to be pulled from side to side and down. So they pull the neck down and from side to side. Now on top of the neck, there's a whole bundle of muscles that attach to all those vertebral processes. So when you start roughing all that in, you get this pretty chunky animal. And one of the other things that struck me when I saw this, she's got really, really wide hips when you see her from the top. Let me adjust this so you can actually see it. There's a little bit of a dark, it's kind of dark in a lot of museums, unfortunately. So sometimes it's hard to get really good pictures. So I don't know how well you can see this. I might have adjusted that to high contrast. But let's see. Yeah, that is too dark. So Sophie's, let me just auto load. No, that's terrible. So Sophie's got these big processes coming off her ilia, come all the way out ways from the body. So if you were to see this from the front, and maybe I should actually adjust the curvature of my body a little bit to reflect that. Like these ilia are really wide. They splay out like this from the front. And it's unfortunate that this picture is a bit dark because it would be nice to show you that. You can kind of see them here. From the top, the ilium has this big round splaying out part in the back, and then this big wing of muscle coming up off the front. So from the front, they're going like that, and then there's these big butt muscles that would attach to the big flange sticking out back here. So these animals were pretty robustly built. They were sturdy creatures. I'm gonna adjust one of my cameras here. It's way off. I like to take the time to reconstruct the muscle groups and really look at how big are these muscles in things like crocodilians and equivalent muscle groups in mammals and birds. Because what I want to do is I want to get a sense of how much meat is on the skeleton. That's important to understanding what this animal's capabilities are in the environment, and also how much energy is flowing through this environment. You need to eat a lot of plants if you're Stegosaurus in order to build that much muscle and nourish this whole huge body. Now, one of the cool things that we see going up the plates of Stegosaurus is there's all these channels, and these are actually blood vessel channels where blood vessels were going through the bone up through the plates. And that's one of the things that tells us that they were nourished, that they were covered by a keratin sheath. That blood running through those vessels nourished that horny skin covering that would have covered the plates. And with Stegosaurs, there's quite a lot of them. It's very similar looking to what we see in things like the horns of cattle. they'll have all these blood vessel channels going through the bone to nourish that big sheath of keratin that, you know, gives like longhorn steers their big horns. So it's reasonable to speculate that in some cases, some of these plates were way bigger than they look in the bone. And I'm going to go pretty extreme with that. There's a study out on an armored dinosaur called Borealopelta that shows that its keratin sheath, because its keratin was actually preserved in the fossil record, its keratin sheaths are substantially bigger than the underlying bone. They CT scanned this beautifully preserved fossil and found, I want to say it's something like 15 to 20% larger in that specimen. And then they looked at the keratin sheaths of cattle and sheep and various reptiles, and they found that there's a really wide range in variation. And considering that Stegosaurus plates were probably doing something for social display, they were showing off with them. I mean, maybe they helped to protect them too. I think it's, and also considering how much blood was going up into those plates and how big they got in large specimens, I think it's reasonable to speculate that there could have been some pretty extreme keratin covering these plates. I'm going to give this one a really wacky shape, like maybe it got damaged or something by an allosaur bite and then healed. I've seen some pretty crazy variation in things like tortoises and turtles who are covered in osteoderms as well. And they can get a lot of different variation just based on the nutrition and wear and tear, any damage that happens to them. So I'm going to give those quite an exaggerated keratin sheath just to kind of get us wondering about what could dinosaurs actually look like. And then with the spikes on the tail, I'm going to go even more extreme because, you know, these things were weapons. You don't want to break the bone in the middle of that osteoderm. If you want to break, if you're going to swing that into a predator, you might miss and hit a tree. You might hit a bone in the predator, and you don't want to break the bone in your tail weapon. So you're going to have a lot of keratin on the end of that thing because you can break off the keratin and regrow it. It's just a fingernail. And that would probably be a pretty bad way to go as a predator, to get one of these, you know, 6-inch or a foot long pieces of basically dinosaur quill stuck in your body somewhere. That could cause infection and take you out of the pool of predators. Now, there's one other interesting osteoderm feature on Stegosauruses that's only been found in a few specimens, and that's this pebble-like carpet that forms a big throat pouch on the throat of Stegosaurus. We didn't know about this for a long time. There's this big like throat shield, and presumably this was to protect them from something like predators or possibly like, you know, rivals if they're swinging their tails at each other or wrestling or something like that. And then I'm going to rough in the face. Now, Stegosaurus has kind of a funny face. It's got a really long, low skull. And in immature specimens like Sophie, they've got these, the eyes don't quite, let's see if I can show you. They've got kind of frowny eyes in Stegosauruses because they've got this loose bone that forms the eyebrow. And in juvenile specimens, it's kind of free floating, but in mature specimens, it actually, enough bone grows, it kind of locks it in place. And Stegosaurus, unlike some other plant-eating dinosaurs like ceratopsids, the horned dinosaurs, Stegosaurus and the other armored dinosaurs tend to have pretty frowny eyes. And the eye is in the back half of the skull. So we've got this hole here, that's where their jaw muscles attached. And then there's a big hole in the skull where the eye goes. And the eye is going to be, what you see on the outside is going to be a bit smaller than that hole you see in the skull because there's all the muscles around the eye that allow the eye to move around. And then in Stegosauruses, there's this big snout and then these holes in the end of the snout. And those holes would have also been smaller than what you see in the skeleton because of cartilage and the keratin of the bill, the dinosaur's beak, covering that up. Now, we don't know yet if Stegosauruses had cheeks. We know that some later armored dinosaurs had cheeks because they actually grew bony osteoderms in their cheeks. And there's a few specimens now of these armored dinosaurs who have a tooth row pretty similar to Stegosaurus, this recessed tooth row with this chopping edge for mashing up plant material. Some of these armored dinosaurs actually protected that whole tooth row with armor. And that tells us that there must have been skin covering this gap in those later animals. But this is a stegosaur. It's earlier. It's further down the family tree. And so we don't know for sure if it had cheeks. For the sake of just, leaving that, or for the sake of sort of telling that evolutionary story, I'm going to give it like half a cheek, because it's not like at the bottom of the family tree. You know, it's far enough along. It's got all these other crazy adaptations for a unique lifestyle. So I'm going to just have the mouth open and go like basically halfway down that tooth row. And that's pretty consistent with also where we see the muscle attachment points on this skull. So hold on, is that glare? I got a pretty brutal glare going because the sun moved. I'm gonna move that so you guys can see. Is that better on the image on the screen? I think there was pretty bad glare going. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm using this dark gray marker, and you can just do this at home with varying, you can use different colored pens or use a pencil and go with varying hardnesses. And what I'm going to start to do is kind of add in some shadows. I'm going to go under here. I'm going to start shading this, and bearing in mind this is a curving animal. So most of my shadow lines, I'm going to give them some curvature to reinforce that sense of there being a curved shape to this animal. And these animals would have had, as far as we can tell from the known skin impressions, they would have had wrinkly skin with really tiny scales on most of it. Slightly larger scales on the throat, but again, like the little osteoderms from the throat, they're like that big on a big stegosaurus, so they're pretty small. I'm going to start to kind of outline my arm and think about how the skin would wrap around that curving form and those big chest muscles. That upper arm is just really embedded in muscle, so it becomes this chunky, kind of like a thickened up alligator arm. Let me give an outline there. And so we're starting to fill out the shape of this animal and get the sense of like, wow, this is when you put even just a minimal amount of muscle onto the bones of something like Stegosaurus and pay attention to all those muscle attachment points, you get this really chunky, powerfully built animal. This thing's kind of like it's tank-like. It's almost like a rhino with crazy spines on its back. Really sturdily built animal. We know from some really beautifully preserved plant-eating dinosaurs like Psittacosaurus from China that this whole hip section, and we see this in birds as well, this whole hips, all these muscles are enclosed in an envelope of skin. So a lot of older dinosaur reconstructions, you'll see this big, deep fold of skin here. We probably wouldn't see too much of that. There'd probably be enough loose skin wrapping around that hip that it would all be pretty well enclosed. You can get back here to the tail. This is the poop chute called the cloaca, where mating and pooping and eggs all come out of that same spot. And then back here, we got this big chunky calf muscles going down to the little powerful stumpy toes. And we can kind of play with some of the scale textures on like the legs and things, because we don't know what the whole body covering of this animal looks like. So we can look at things like crocodiles and lizards and even birds and start to speculate, well, I don't know, maybe they had some shield scales like crocs and birds do, or maybe it was just completely covered in the little fine pebbly textures. Now that I've got some of these surface textures roughed out, I'm starting to feel like it's time to start playing with color. Now, with an animal like Stegosaurus that's grown all this crazy stuff out of its back, I think it's completely reasonable to treat it like an exotic lizard or bird. Like it's basically peacocking, but with bony spines on its back. Especially in those large individuals where the plate really flares out at the bottom, that can't really serve a protective function. It's like just a big advertising plate or something like that. So for the sake of discussion, I'm going to do some really bright colors, and I'm going to put some crazy colors on the plates, and I'm going to even vary up the pattern across the plates. You know, we can see in some birds will like repeat patterns over and over again in their display features, and some birds will have like multiple different colors in different parts of their wings and tails and other display stuff. Same thing with lizards. There's so much variation. When animals start picking their mates based on style, basically the animals are selecting for genetic diversity, and that drives evolution forward with all this crazy mutation and random wild stuff going on. There've actually studies have even been done on modern birds where they've taken and given one male of a species of bird, they've given him they've just stuck another feather on his head, like given him a blue feather that no other member of his species has. And they've shown that, sure enough, the females pick the guy with the weird, surprising fashion. Studies have also been done on things like deer. So deer and elk, they've looked at what males the females prefer, and by and large, the females prefer bucks with bigger racks that are symmetrical. So if the rack is asymmetrical, the females don't like it that much. And all of this is sort of revealing that animals are shaping themselves to a degree. They're kind of choosing their own evolutionary destiny by expressing some level of preference for one thing or another. So I'm going wild bright with these osteoderms, hypothesizing that, you know, maybe stegosaurs of one gender or another or both, maybe they like bright red. And it's kind of a trope in paleoart to say that the bright one, oh, it's got to be the male because it's bright. And that's not consistent in birds. In birds and reptiles, there are species where the females are the larger and showier individuals, and it all just depends on what role they're playing in the ecology, but also in sort of the social structure of those animals. In the case of in birds of prey, the female needs to be big enough to carry prey and eggs. So in a lot of birds of prey, the female is actually bigger than the male. And in things like secretary birds, which are a really cool bird of prey from Africa that stalks through the savannah and kicks snakes and lizards to death, in secretary birds, the females are much showier than the males. In things like kingfishers and who else? There's a handful of other bird groups where the females and males are both showy. And it all has to do with selection within the species. Who's picking who based on what? In a lot of bird species, the females are indeed not as showy because they're sitting on the nest and incubating the eggs. Now, scientists think that a lot of dinosaurs probably didn't sit on the nest because they weighed tons. You know, you can't easily sit on your eggs without crushing them. And the known dinosaur nest sites of large dinosaurs seem to suggest that they were doing something like crocodilians and actually building a compost pile to protect their eggs. And well, to protect their eggs and to keep them warm as the vegetation rots, it keeps the eggs moist and warm. So if dinosaurs were doing something like that, maybe the females would have bright, showy coloring to ward off predators if they guarded their nest. Or maybe they didn't guard their nest at all. And like some lizards, they, you know, both male and female are pretty much the same coloration, whatever that may be. So I'm giving this one like just bright, showy spines to let all the allosaurs and ceratosaurs in the area know, back off, you get thagamized. Julia, how are we doing on time? So we'll give some more.
Oh, we're doing pretty good. You got about 15 minutes before the hour's up. Okay. So maybe another 5 minutes of drawing and then we'll open up to some questions. I did see some questions pop up in chat. So those of you who haven't thought of a question yet, go ahead and start typing.
Yeah, let us know. Also, I'm open to suggestions, Julia. If you get any, if anybody's saying like, hey, you know, I'm not seeing you use that fuchsia marker, maybe you should, you know, give me some input on, you know, just style points for the Stegosaurus. You know, I collaborate with scientists, so I try and listen as much as possible to what they think would be cool or plausible for these different animals. And so right now I'm just freestyling a crazy, colorful Stegosaurus. I'm open to suggestions.
Well, you know, I was out in the desert recently and saw some beautiful Colorado collared lizards that have this wonderful block coloring around the head and neck, where you have sections that are all one color and then a section that's all different color.
I love that. I'm going to take that and I'm going to do a collared lizard move and make the head and neck like bright yellow. Collared lizards are one of my favorite, they're part of one of my favorite groups of lizards, the Crotophytidae. And one of the things that's cool about them is that they can run on their hind legs, and they also specialize, well, not specialize, but one of the things they do regularly is eat other lizards. They have these big heads and powerful jaws, so they can gulp down other lizards. And yeah, the males are just so colorful. And again, it's another one where there's a lot of variation across their range. There's a handful of species. I think there's about 10 species of collared lizards, and they live all throughout the southwestern deserts and even into the east a bit. And yeah, they're crazy colorful. There's blue ones, there's green ones. Here in California, we get ones that are a little more camouflage looking. There's ones that have like really intense, like almost like fiery coloration. Another cool thing about them is that they do something in the breeding season
where basically the males and females both get really, high contrast coloration in the breeding season. And if I recall correctly, it's when the females get gravid or they're, pregnant with eggs, the females will actually get orange splotches and bars on their body to signal that I'm not receptive. So weirdly enough, they're using a bright color to signal that they're, if I remember correctly, they're using a bright color to signal that they don't want to mate, which is kind of interesting. So in this case, we're treating the bright colors as maybe it's a way to show off to potential mates, and maybe it's a way to warn predators that, like, you really don't want to mess with this. I'm not camouflaging because I will swat you. I'm gonna grab, I got some like kind of reddish brown is nice. I'm gonna salute the collared lizards with kind of a reddish brown collar around here. Should probably.
We do have a request for a blue throat pouch.
Oh man, I already colored the throat pouch. I already colored it yellow. I'll go blue chest since that's not colored yet. And I'll make these blue stripes going up. I mean, because if I throw the blue on the yellow, then we'll have a green throat pouch. I mean, we could do that too. Maybe we'll do a little transition zone. It's one of the things that's really fun to play with dinosaur artists, all the different color possibilities. We don't really fully understand how animals are making all of their different pigments and hues. And, it's something that people are studying right now. And, only time will tell exactly what's plausible. I'm gonna give it a blue eye as well, just for the heck of it. And I'm gonna transition that blue into this light purple. We're just having fun out here. We're making a reef fish stegosaurus. This thing looks like it belonged in a tropical reef or an aviary, which is fitting because there's tons of weird animals walking around the Morrison. And we now know one of the cool things that's been discovered in recent years is that there was more than one type of stegosaur walking around. There's this big long tail spine and a few vertebrae from, I believe, Wyoming. It's Wyoming or Montana. It's in the northern part. You know what I'm talking about? Alcovasaurus, Julia? There's this weird thing that they think is related to an animal from Portugal called Miragaia. And it's like, it doesn't have the same plates as Stegosaurus. It has an even longer neck, so probably able to reach even higher vegetation. And it's got just these crazy long spines on its tail. I'm gonna give, let's see, that's making a horrible noise and showing up. That's the worst of both worlds.
Well, and there's even multiple species of Stegosaurus in the Morrison, depending on who you talk to, how many species there are.
Yeah, so I was actually asking Susie Maidman about that when I was at the NHM in London, and she's been on papers that have talked about there being multiple species, but then when I was talking to her, she's like, the problem is that the main difference between individual specimens of Stegosaurus is their plate shape, but we don't have enough complete Stegosaurus specimens to say for sure if it actually forms a species or if that's just individual variation. And then she was saying the other problem with everything in the Morrison is because it's so big and spans such a long period of time, it's hard to say which of these animals actually like coexisted with each other. And that's something that you guys I know are working on at the MyGap Moor Quarry, trying to figure out like exactly what's the age of the stuff you're digging up, so we can figure out what species of apatosaur and whatnot are found there. So I like to just channel all of my time spent at aquariums and looking at pictures of fish and lizards and just like have fun, especially in these sketching phases with all kinds of different possibilities. I think a lot of times when talking with paleoart people get really hung up on whether something's plausible or accurate. And I think at a certain point, you kind of have to let your creative juices flow and play with different possibilities, especially in the sketching phase. This isn't going out in a scientific paper. We're exploring ideas right now. We're not trying to prove anyone wrong or, have the best and most accurate Stegosaurus of all time. We're exploring the possibilities of Stegosaurus. And, maybe in doing that, we'll spark an idea for another research project that might help to sort some of this stuff out. Maybe somebody knows about Stegosaurus specimens that haven't been described yet. one of the things that we found when we were surveying in central Utah is we found 2 new stegosaur sites that are really low down in the Morrison. And the general consensus among the different Morrison researchers is that the formation gets older the further southwest you go. And where we've been looking is pretty far down in the southwest and pretty low in the layers of rock. So we think we found one of the oldest stegosaur specimens ever. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to excavate it. It's in this really remote, both of them are in these really remote canyons. One of them is up on a cliff about like 15 feet high. So, you know, only time will tell as we find more specimens, you know, what was really going on with stegosaurs. How many species were there? You know, was there differences between males and females? How big did they get on average? Were most of the stegosaurs walking around juveniles that didn't, you know, that were they reaching sexual maturity young and in laying eggs right away in order to ensure the survival of the species? Or were there a decent population of large ones walking around, fully mature ones that were defending themselves successfully from predators, but maybe not getting fossilized in the Morrison Basin? Maybe they migrated out. It's one of the rarer animals in the Morrison. And I just think they're so cool. I mean, even if you took all the colors off of this thing, it's just such a crazy looking animal. It's like you can take all the colors off and cut off all my elongated spines. It's still like one of the weirdest animals I've ever heard of.
Well, Brian, we have a question. Do you think it would be plausible for filaments to be in Stegosaurus? Because we see filaments in Psittacosaurs and we see filaments in Tianulong. Would Stegosaurus possibly have filaments?
Well, so yeah, the family tree seems to suggest that filaments were cropping up all over the dinosaur family tree, and it's possible that they shared a common ancestor with pterosaurs that was fuzzy. Now, some people don't like this idea, but for what it's worth, you know, I've done some work with people who work on the early Jurassic and the Triassic, and they have told me, like, yeah, if they were reconstructing something like, you know, Coelophysis or some of these early plant-eating dinosaurs, they would put filaments on all of them because a lot of the really bird-like skeletal traits can be observed way down at the base of the family tree. In the case of Stegosaurus, you know, some researchers think they prefer the hypothesis that as dinosaurs got bigger, their bodies would hold too much heat to have fuzz or filaments. But then again, you could also have filaments that don't really trap heat. They could even shade the body. One of the things, I used to work at the Santa Barbara Zoo, and they had giant anteaters, and it was really cool. I never knew that the big shaggy tail of an anteater serves a very practical function. When an anteater goes to sleep, they wrap their tail around and they go to sleep under an umbrella of their shaggy tail. So I think until you find a whole mummified animal in an environment that wouldn't wash away fine hairs and filaments, yeah, it seems plausible to me. If you look at the carcasses of frozen woolly mammoths and frozen woolly rhinos in Siberia, those are only like 10,000 years old. And a lot of those carcasses don't have the hair on them. By the time they get buried, a lot of the hair is blown away or washed away. And, you know, we know those animals were hairy because, you know, of cave paintings and of, you know, there's some hair intact. And they lived in a cold environment. So it makes sense that they would be covered in shaggy hair. But if these guys had if they just had like a handful of small bristly filaments, or even what if they had like porcupine-like quills, and maybe the big spines are just the ones that had bone reinforcing them, and the rest of the tail was like some crazy, like brutal porcupine quill pile. I mean, those might never preserve. They're thin. You got me thinking about, my phone is saying low battery. We there?
Yeah, we're here. We just lost video for a second. It's okay.
Sorry about that. Amazingly, Zoom uses enough power that my phone loses battery even when it's plugged in when I'm zooming. I don't know where it cut off, but I was saying it seemed plausible to me that, yeah, you could have like porcupine-like quills on a armored dinosaur that might never preserve. They might attach into the skin and, you know, add some added defense from predators
maybe these ones are for deterring the big allosaurs, and then all the little extra spines are for, brushing away small, predators threatening your nest and young. I mean, I don't know.
Hey, Brian.
Seems plausible to me. I've seen crazier stuff in the modern animal world.
How plausible do you think it would be that these guys roaming through the forests of the Morrison would have gotten stuff stuck in their plates? Why would there be like maybe dead leaves and branches get stuck in there? They seem like a natural place for stuff to get stuck.
Love it. Totally. Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah. Did these guys groom? Could they groom each other? With this long neck, how far back can you reach to like pull junk out of your plates? I mean, a lot of times people don't think about reptiles as grooming creatures, but they totally do. They're Galapagos tortoises at the zoo love to have their neck scratched, because in the wild there's little birds that land on their neck, pick off parasites and pieces of dead skin and stuff. So yeah, I mean, what was the life of a stegosaurus like? Roaming through forests, probably wading into bogs and water holes and getting covered in mud. Like, what did it look like? Yeah, maybe it was really bright underneath, but then it was just like layers of sediment and dirt just caked on. I think one of the great details of the first Jurassic Park movie was with the Triceratops. If you watch the behind the scenes, they painted this beautiful reptilian, lizardy crocodile pattern all over their Triceratops. And they got it on set in Kauai. And the special effects designer, Stan Winston, said, it just doesn't look right. It's too clean. And so he ordered his crew of special effects people to get buckets of red dirt. They're on Kauai, so they're beautiful red, rust red soil. And they just rubbed dirt all over their Triceratops. And it makes it look so realistic because, that's what we see in things like rhinos and elephants. They intentionally cover themselves with dirt to help with parasites and to, keep some of the sun off their skin. So yeah, I think it's totally plausible. Like, what if this guy's walking along and he walks under a sauropod when it poops, and then it just makes just a pile of fertilizer back here? I don't have a green marker, so I'm gonna draw. I guess I'm gonna go blue and yellow, and you could have like plants growing out of the back of the Stegosaurus as little araucarioid trees and stuff sprout out of the back, and ferns and stuff. Who knows? I think it's completely plausible, maybe. Or maybe it's idiotic, but it's fun to think about. Nobody's hurt by it. Try a little baby araucaria tree sprouting here. I don't know if you guys can see that on camera.
All right, well, we're about to the end of our hour, so we're going to have a last call for any other questions in the chat, and we'll have Brian answer those, and then we'll say goodbye to Brian and his walking, vegetation-covered stegosaur. Oh, here's a fun one. How do you think stegosaurs would have mated?
Oh, geez. So that's one that people have speculated about, even in the book. There's a book, All Yesterdays, where they showed a stegosaurus with a very elongated reproductive organ. Who knows? I mean, a lot of people don't realize that lizards, the male lizards, actually have what they call hemipenes. They have a projection going in each direction, because I guess it's inconvenient to have to go all the way to the other side of a female, because the lizards are quite long. Who knows? Maybe they convergently evolved something like that. We know crocodiles have, a male organ for mating, whereas birds don't. Birds just press theirs. Most birds don't. Ducks have a crazy whole situation with ducks. So there's a lot of variation in the soft tissue of modern animals. And there's some pretty substantial differences between birds and some other birds and crocodilians. There's no bones in that part, at least in reptiles. Some mammals actually have bones related to that. We don't see that in dinosaurs, so who knows? I think they probably had to be pretty careful. With lizards, the male will bite the female in a lot of species and kind of like hold her in place. Sharks do something, they're kind of rough and violent, but crocodiles, interestingly enough, are super gentle. The male courts the female by blowing
blowing bubbles all around her. And like, then they rub snouts together. Crocodiles have actually really sensitive, really acute sense of touch on their snouts and actually across their whole body. So they're with crocodiles, it's like this big dangerous animal. You think it's gonna be really aggressive and like, super, rough when it comes to romance time. No, they're super, super gentle with each other. And maybe they have to be because they're crocodiles, maybe stegosaurs had to be so they wouldn't accidentally impale each other. It's like, you got to be, biology has all these weird caveats and ways of getting around interesting problems. So who knows?
All right. So we have a comment from Karen that direwolves had those bacula, the bone in the penis. There's a very famous, if you go on to some of the fossil cast purchasing websites, you can find a replica of a walrus baculum that's been broken and healed in place.
Ooh, that's brutal. If I remember correctly, there's a mnemonic device for remembering which mammal groups have bones in their dude junk. And if I recall correctly, it's crap, which is, I think it's Chiroptera. What's R?
Rodents?
Or maybe it's carnivore, which would include, dogs and cats and all those guys. And then I forget what R is. And then the A is Artiodactyla. So, deer and antelopes and those guys, if I recall correctly. And then P, I think, is pinnipeds, but those are carnivores. That's a terrible mnemonic device because I totally can't remember. Anyway, you can look it up. It's not all mammals, but some of them. So yeah, pretty weird.
One last question from the chat about stegosaurs and not about mammal junk. What do you think about Stegosaurus being a cycad specialist?
I think with an animal this size, we know with elephants, they exploited every possible food source. Stegosaurs' necks are surprisingly long, much longer than, have been traditionally depicted based on incomplete specimens. And with these tall hips and these massive tail muscles and hip muscles, I think they would have had no problem rearing up. So I think they probably could have eaten from small trees and things easily. And the other thing is that the Morrison cycad record really isn't that good. We're just now starting to find a lot more plant sites. Some of the people I've been working with, John Foster in particular, also Carol G, Mary Beth Bennis, they have been focusing on trying to find plants in the Morrison to understand this ecology more fully. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the plants we're finding are ferns, ginkgophytes, conifers, things that suggest a really lush and wet environment. And that's a bit of a spoiler for upcoming installments of my documentary project, Jurassic Reimagined, that I've been working with, which features Julia and some of the finds from the Mygat Moor Quarry. So yeah, my inclination from modern animals is that big herbivores have to eat a lot. And in an environment like the Morrison, where there was sometimes droughts, they probably weren't too picky when it got down to difficult times. Elephants eat all kinds of stuff. Elephants will rip the bark off of trees and eat the pulp from trees. They'll eat sticks. They'll eat fruit. They'll eat leaves. Giraffes are the same way. We think of giraffes as acacia specialists because they have those long necks and those long tongues for eating the acacia leaves. But giraffes eat grass too. They bend down and eat grass, and they eat from small bushes. So, I think in order to sustain an animal this big, you can't be too specialized because you got to get tons of nutrition. But yeah, so I guess the short answer is really, I think most of the animals we find in the fossil record are probably the most abundant animals in that ecosystem. And very often, most abundant animal usually isn't specialists. Yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your humor and your art with us. And thank you to all of our participants who stuck it out for all 4 lectures. We really appreciate you being with us for our socially distanced dinosaur days. And hopefully in 2022, we'll be back with our normal chaos of in-person dinosaur day. And maybe, just maybe, we can convince Brian to stop by once again. He occasionally shows up for Dinosaur Day.
I try to wherever possible. I
Yeah.
appreciate you guys having me. This has been fun.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Have a great night, everybody. And we're getting lots
Bye.
of thank yous in the chat, and I will send you a copy of the saved chat.
Awesome.
As an email.
Appreciate y'all. Thanks for your questions. Especially, I'm honored that that I'm the person that you guys asked about dinosaur junk. Sorry to all the parents and kids that are now have to have the birds and the bees and the stegosaur talk.
Well, if you're gonna learn about the birds and the bees, might as well learn it using dinosaurs.
Stegosaurus, man. Mesozoic sex symbol.
All right. Good night, everybody.